This is a story of love and bravery of the soul, a call to embrace a suffering humanity. Who open their hands, they are needy. Who stretch out their arms, they are poor. Crying for mercy, yet they're turned away. Though they're never abandoned by God.
My name is Sister Mary Clara. I was 18 years old in 1872, and I lived with my brother at a lodging house he operated in New York City. It was there in November that I met Mother Mary Odilia Berger and the sisters from Germany. I first saw them when they took their evening meal at our table. I noticed how ardent their prayers were, and I could see that, although they were tired after their long voyage, they were eager for the next part of their journey, the trip to St. Louis. There was something about those sisters. To this day, I can't explain it. It must have been the Holy Spirit at work, because I can find no other words for the connection that I felt. The next day, we bade them goodbye, and they left for the railroad station and the train that would take them to St. Louis. I wanted to help them in some way. At the last minute, I took a basket from our pantry and stuffed it full of food. I rushed to the station and searched the crowds for the sisters. I found them just as they were about to board the train. I handed Mother Odilia the basket. I wished them Godspeed on their journey, and I prayed that I would see them again.
The five sisters arrived on the St. Louis riverfront on an icy winter morning. The temperature hovered near zero. The sisters were in good spirit, though. They had traveled a long way and were eager to start their new lives. Although St. Louis was a bustling metropolis, its riverfront was a refuge for the poor. Houses were overcrowded, food and water were contaminated, raw sewage lined the open gutters, and waste from the slaughterhouses rotted in the streets. The sisters had known poverty, but they had never seen such squalor. The filthy conditions bred cholera and diphtheria. Soon after the sisters arrived, smallpox broke out and spread quickly. The sisters did what they had come to America to do. They cared for people who were sick. They arrived at the houses of smallpox patients in the morning and sometimes stayed all night, caring for entire families. As a result of their devotion, for a time they were called the Smallpox Sisters. Because the disease was so contagious, they were not allowed to ride the horse-drawn trolleys. Instead, they traveled on foot, sometimes for several miles, to get to their patients' homes. Each sister was required to carry a bell to warn the healthy that she had been exposed to smallpox. It fell to Mother Odilia to support the sisters. She carried Mary Clara's basket through the streets, begging for food, medicine, money, whatever people could give her. Some of what she collected, she gave away to other needy people, and some she kept to feed and clothe the sisters. By the time the smallpox epidemic ended, more than 1,500 people had died.
I heard a story about our sisters today. It seems that a man came to the door of the convent begging for food. The good Lord sent him to our door, knowing we would not refuse him. But his request came at a time when we were in need ourselves. A sister took his request to Mother Odilia and explained that she did not know what to do. There was only one loaf of bread in the house, and our weary sisters would have no food when they returned. Without hesitation, Mother Odilia replied, "Give the poor man what he asks, sister. The Lord will provide for us." The sister was only half convinced, but she obeyed. A few hours later, there was a faint knock at our door. When the sister opened it, to her surprise, there stood a little girl, barely 6 years old. In her outstretched arms was a pan of freshly baked rolls. The sister grinned broadly and exclaimed, "The Lord has come. You are the Lord today, little one," which of course startled the child, who did not understand her joy.
The fledgling congregation grew and came to be known as the Sisters of St. Mary. Women were drawn to the community by the sisters' compassion, selflessness, and good works. By 1876, there were almost 20 Sisters of St. Mary, growth the congregation would need as it faced its next challenge.
Mother Odilia gave from her poverty, sharing her gifts from a basket filled with hope. She opened her hands to the needy. She stretched out her arms to the poor, extending true mercy, turning no one away, revealing the presence of God.
5 years passed quickly. The sisters continued to provide care in the homes of their patients. Mother Odilia continued to travel the streets, basket in hand, asking for contributions to support the sisters in their work. By 1877, the congregation numbered 30. It was difficult to care for people in the crowded tenements where the sick, the recovering, and the dead often lay in the same room. It was even more difficult to care for people who were homeless, people who lived in the open gangways, alleys, and side streets of the riverfront. Mother Odilia decided a hospital would be the best way to care for patients. Even though St. Louis had 15 hospitals in 1877, few served poor people and immigrants. Eventually, Mother found an abandoned mansion on a large plot of land in a wealthy neighborhood. It was 3 stories high, with wide porches and tall windows that let in the light. Although the building was empty, the neighbors didn't want a hospital for the poor. But Mother Odilia persisted. She wanted her patients to experience clean streets and breathe clean air. She thought if they could see what healthy living was, they might learn to live healthier lives.
In 1873, I left my family in New York and traveled to St. Louis to be with Mother Odilia and the sisters. I decided that I wanted to give my life in service to others, just as they were doing, and so I joined the congregation. I was in St. Louis when Mother went to the bank to get a loan so we could buy the mansion and open it as a hospital. It cost $16,000. This was more money than I could have imagined. When Mother met with the banker, he seemed concerned. He said to her, "This is a large sum of money to lend to sisters, Reverend Mother. Because the bank would eventually like to be paid, I have to ask, is there someone who will help you assume this responsibility?" "Of course," Mother answered him with a smile. "St. Joseph will be our security. He has never let us down in anything we have done." Startled, yet at the same time moved by her faith, the banker replied, "With such good backing for your financial stability, I would be foolish to refuse you." He lent us the money.
On May 24, 1877, St. Mary's Infirmary opened. The very first patient could not afford to pay for his care. The sisters wrote his name into the book and registered him as ODL, our dear Lord's.
Open your eyes, behold all the lives who carry on, revived by love and prayer.
1878 started out uneventfully for the sisters. On May 24th, they celebrated the first anniversary of St. Mary's Infirmary. By June, the weather was hot and deadly. Horses died and people became sick from the heat. Streetcar traffic came to a standstill, and inside the infirmary, the sisters sweltered in their woolen habits. There was no relief from the heat. When it rained, the streets grew clogged with dirt and waste. Rain mixed with sewage to form foul ponds, perfect for spreading disease. And sure enough, yellow fever broke out in July. But farther south, things were worse. On August 13th, the first case of yellow fever was reported in Memphis. As the epidemic spread, people panicked and fled the city.
In late August, Mother Odilia received a letter from some physicians in Memphis describing the desperate conditions there. Men, women, and children lay sick and dying. The doctors begged for help. And so Mother asked for volunteers to go to Memphis. We understood the danger, but we were not afraid. Many of us volunteered, trusting in the will of our Lord. Mother agonized over sending our sisters into such danger. But whole families were dying, and help was desperately needed. So she decided to send 5 sisters who were young and strong. And she began praying for their safe return.
September 2nd, 1878. By the time the sisters arrived in Memphis, the city was a ghost town. Businesses were boarded up and supplies could not be found. Even the doctors and nurses had become ill with yellow fever. The sisters immediately went to work. They were needed everywhere at once, and they did what they could to care for the ill and the dying. They wrote to Mother Odilia describing the horrific conditions and asking for more sisters. Again, the sisters willingly volunteered, and Mother sent 3 more to Memphis. The 8 sisters worked without rest until their health began to fail. Sister Wilhelmina was the first to get sick, and before long, 5 of them were ill. Back in St. Louis, Mother Odilia received another urgent request, this time from Canton, Mississippi. Again, it was yellow fever. For a third time, she asked for volunteers, and for a third time, the sisters willingly offered themselves. She selected 5 more sisters to go to Canton. By mid-September, more than 1/3 of the congregation had been sent to care for people in desperate need, far from St. Louis.
A few days ago, we received the news. In Memphis, our beloved sisters, Wilhelmina, Stanislaus, Gertrude, and Vincentia, are dead, and all of the sisters in Canton are sick. Mother is beside herself with grief. Our hearts are with our sisters who are so far from home. We want to go to them, but their last letter begged us to send no more help. Anyone who goes to either city could be lost to the fever.
Fall came, and with it the first frost. On October 29th, 1878, the Memphis Board of Health declared the epidemic over. The cooler temperatures brought an end to the disease in Canton as well. More than 5,000 people in both cities died of yellow fever during the terrible summer of 1878. Among the dead were 5 sisters of St. Mary. The oldest was 28 years old. A mass of requiem was held at St. Mary's Church in St. Louis to honor the sisters who had died. During their 2 months in Memphis and Canton, the sisters had cared for more than 500 patients. Mother Odilia was inconsolable over the loss of the sisters. She took to her bed for a time, and, although she would recover, she would never be the same.
When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever
In October 1880, Mother Odilia received word from Rome that the congregation had been given official approval by the church. The dream of her lifetime had become reality. Several days later, she fell ill. She carried on in pain at first, but soon her condition worsened. With her sisters at her side, Mother Mary Odilia Berger died on October 17, 1880. She was 58 years old. Her death most likely was caused by appendicitis.
Oh, how we grieve. The sadness overwhelms us. How could God have taken our dear mother from us so soon? It is only our faith that keeps us going, and the knowledge that we are easing the suffering of so many people.
On her deathbed, Mother Odilia had unhesitatingly named Sister Seraphia her successor, telling the sisters, "Sister is a better organizer than I am, and the congregation needs what she has to offer." And so it was that Mother Seraphia took over. She was a disciplined woman who had been given the unenviable task of following the congregation's foundress. The new Mother Superior was firm with the sisters, and her demeanor contrasted sharply with Mother Odilia's determined but loving ways. As the years passed, tension in the congregation grew. Finally, in January 1894, several of the sisters decided they could no longer continue under the leadership of Mother Seraphia, and they separated from the congregation.
Our dear sisters left this morning. Although I will miss them, I know they trust in God and believe they have a calling. I am sure they will do great things. In the name of Jesus, we wish them Godspeed.
The sisters traveled to Maryville, Missouri, where they received temporary shelter from another congregation. It was not long before they formed the Sisters of St. Francis and elected Sister Mary Augustine Geeson Mother Superior. Under Mother Augustine's mandate, "Turn no one away," the sisters began caring for the people of Northwest Missouri. In their first year, they cared for 85 patients in their convent, which doubled as a hospital, and they visited the sick in their homes. The sisters traveled the long distances to farmhouses, either alone or with complete strangers. If they were lucky, they would ride in buggies, but it was common to see them hitching a ride on the back of lumber wagons. The little convent was so small that the community raised funds to build a hospital and then donated the furniture to fill it. St. Joseph Hospital of Maryville, Missouri was dedicated on November 26, 1895. Less than 10 years later, its name would change to St. Francis Hospital because its mail kept mistakenly being delivered to St. Joseph Hospital in St. Joseph, Missouri.
Word has arrived about our sisters in Maryville. They have constructed a wonderful new hospital, and their work is an example to all. Here in St. Louis, we have been able to help many people as well. So far this year, we have cared for more than 1,300 patients, and more than half of them were our dear Lord's. What a blessing it is to serve those in need. And we now have nearly 100 Sisters of St. Mary. The more sisters, the more good we can do in the world.
In the spring of 1898, two Sisters of St. Francis went on a begging tour to raise money for the hospital in Maryville. They traveled by railroad to the Oklahoma Territory, stopping along the way at towns and railroad camps to beg for funds. When they met with a pastor in Oklahoma City to ask permission to collect there, he refused, unless the money they collected there was used there. By the time the visit was over, he had convinced the sisters to ask Mother Augustine if they could build a hospital there. So Mother decided to visit Oklahoma City. She found a vibrant community, but not a single hospital. And people were dying, mostly from the lack of care when they became sick. On July 18, 1898, the Sisters of St. Francis rented two houses. The sisters would live in one, the other would become St. Anthony Hospital. It was the first hospital in the Oklahoma Territory. Years later, on the site of that hospital, another historic building would be erected and then tragically destroyed, the Murrah Federal Building.
We are standing on holy ground, and I know that there are angels all around. So let us praise, oh praise God now, oh praise Him now, for we are standing in His presence on holy ground.
At the end of the 19th century, tuberculosis was debilitating, contagious, and often deadly. Patients had hacking coughs and bloody phlegm, and doctors were reluctant to admit them to the hospital for fear of contagion. The belief was that the best remedy was simply a good climate. At St. Mary's Infirmary in St. Louis, Sister Mary Helen Kyle was in charge of admissions, so it became her responsibility to turn away patients with tuberculosis. But Sister Helen felt sorry for them. In 1890, she convinced the sisters to open 2 isolation wards in St. Mary's Infirmary. From the day they opened, the wards were full, and it became clear that a separate facility would be ideal. But financially, the congregation was stretched thin. St. Mary's Infirmary refused no one, and the Sisters of St. Mary had just opened a hospital in St. Charles, Missouri. If a third facility was going to be built, Sister Mary Helen would have to raise the money herself.
My name is Sister Mary Helen Kyle. Glory be to God. Mother Seraphia has granted my wish of having a hospital just for the consumptives. The poor people are often abandoned because of their disease. They can hardly receive proper care, even at our infirmary, since St. Mary's is surrounded by factories and a nearby brewery spews foul air. Consumptives need clean air above all else, so I asked permission to build them their own hospital. Today, Mother agreed that we could. Now all I have to do is raise the money for the building.
In 1898, Sister Mary Helen Kyle was 32 years old, and she refused to be overwhelmed by the enormity of her task. She and another sister began to beg for money. On their first day, they received a grand total of 65 cents. Day in and day out, they would come back to the convent with pennies. But their faith was unwavering, and they gratefully accepted whatever amount was given and put it toward the fund. The more they begged, the more the fund grew. In the fall of 1899, they met a family who agreed to sell their estate to the sisters for $12,000. They used the money collected by Sister Mary Helen as a down payment. The house sat high on a hill in South St. Louis on 5 acres of land. Best of all, it was surrounded by pure, fresh air. Mount St. Rose Throat and Chest Hospital opened on September 16, 1900, with 3 tuberculosis patients. One of them was Sister Mary Helen. She would die of the disease in 1912 at the age of 46.
Wiping a feverish brow and holding a weary hand, heavy-clad angels embraced those the world denied. They opened their hands to the needy. They stretched out their arms arms to the poor, extending true mercy, turning no one away, revealing the presence of God.
The 20th century dawned. St. Louis hosted the 1904 World's Fair, and the hot dog and the ice cream cone were introduced to American cuisine. The following year, the Sisters of St. Mary opened St. Mary's Hospital in Jefferson City, Missouri. The young century saw advances in the professions of medicine and nursing. In St. Louis, the Sisters of St. Mary opened a nursing school for sisters in 1907. The following year, the Sisters of St. Francis opened one at St. Anthony Hospital in Oklahoma City.
What a time of grace it is. So much is happening in this modern new century. The Sisters of St. Mary and the Sisters of St. Francis are doing great things for the glory of God.
Blue Island, Illinois was a small but growing community in the early 1900s. The nearest hospital was in Chicago, 16 miles away. For the sick, that meant a day trip by horse and an eternity on foot. So the Sisters of St. Mary stepped in. Through a priest, they learned of the need for a hospital in Blue Island. The congregation paid $10,000 down on a $30,000 house. When one of the sisters expressed concern about going so far into debt, she was told, "Trust in God, be kind to the poor, and all will be well." On September 28, 1904, 5 sisters left St. Louis for Blue Island. They were in high spirits and carried with them $50, which would have to last until they could get the hospital up and running. To make their dollar stretch, the sisters subsisted on potatoes, bread, pumpkin, and pancakes. To save on supplies, they pulled nails out of the boards so that both the boards and the nails could be reused to renovate the building. Their frugal approach extended to other aspects of the hospital. The sisters decided that their kitchen table would do double duty. They would eat their meals on it, and it would also serve as the operating room table. St. Francis Hospital opened in 1905. The citizens of Blue Island were so grateful they offered to provide free electricity and water to the hospital for the next 15 years, an offer the sisters were delighted to accept. In the early years of the 20th century, Madison, Wisconsin was a bustling metropolis with 28,000 people, but only one hospital. For years, the city fathers had tried unsuccessfully to convince Catholic sisters to open one. In February 1910, Mother Seraphia received one of those requests, but opening a hospital in Madison seemed utterly impossible. There was a limit to what one congregation could do. In August, she visited anyway, and St. Mary's Hospital opened on September 22, 1912. The 70-bed, red brick building with gray limestone trim was a marvel to behold.
Only 2 years after St. Mary's opened, the First World War began. They called it the War to End All Wars. Oh, what a terrible time it was. 65 million men went to war. More than 10 million died, and countless millions more were never the same. Oh, what brutality. When it ended, after 4 years of hell, the survivors returned, shells of the men they had been. It seemed that the suffering was finally over, but God gave us something more, something even worse than anyone could have imagined.
The influenza pandemic of 1918 killed more than 50 million people worldwide. influenza arrived at St. Mary's Hospital in Madison with the soldiers. First, it was one soldier, then another, and before long, dozens of young soldiers arrived, sick with the deadly disease. The sisters moved the other patients to accommodate them, and soon the entire second floor of the hospital was filled with influenza victims.
Our sisters worked tirelessly to care for everyone who was sick, and no one worked harder than Sister Fortunata. As the number of patients grew, our sisters set up an isolation ward for the soldiers, and Sister Fortunata took charge. She called them her soldier boys. Day and night she cared for them, always with a smile, going from one to the other through the crowded ward, mopping their fevered brows and coaxing them to take in liquids. She worked 20 hours a day, to the point of exhaustion, but she nursed most of her charges back to health. But her tireless devotion took its toll, and Sister Fortunata became ill. She died of influenza on October 21st, 1918, at the age of 32. The day after her death, the headline in the Madison paper read, "The Angel of St. Mary's is dead." How true those words were. She was an angel. Someone told me about one of Sister's soldier boys. As he stood over Sister Fortunata's coffin, he exclaimed, "Why did I not die instead of her? My life is not worth anything, but she could have done so much good." Such are the ways of God.
They open their hands to the needy. They stretched out their arms to the poor, extending true mercy, turning no one away, revealing the presence of God.
I died in 1931, at the very old age of 77 years. On my deathbed, I told my sisters that my life had been lived in service to others in the name of God, and I could not have imagined a greater life. Death separates us from those we love among the living, but it reunites us with those we have not seen for many years. Such a reunion it was in heaven. But that's a story for another day. I continue to observe the glorious works of the Sisters of St. Mary and the Sisters of St. Francis. Oh, what wonderful work it is. Mother Odilia told me she could never have imagined how her ministry would grow, and how many people would be helped because the sisters were there. To be of service to people in need, it is the greatest gift of all.
In 1933, America was in the midst of the Great Depression. 1 out of 4 Americans was out of work, and it was not a good time to begin something new. Nevertheless, the Sisters of St. Mary saw a need. St. Louis, like most of America, was segregated at the time. The 2 hospitals that accepted Negro patients were routinely filled beyond capacity, and often 2 patients had to share a single bed. So the sisters converted St. Mary's Infirmary into the first Catholic hospital in the United States for African Americans. Not only did the hospital provide a refuge for African Americans who were ill, it offered African American nurses and physicians a place where they could practice their professions. When St. Louis integrated in the 1950s, St. Mary's Infirmary was opened to everyone, and in 1974, the sisters sold the hospital because it was no longer needed. The St. Louis Argus, an African-American newspaper, wrote this eulogy for the infirmary. To properly assess our deep love and affection for the people who ran and worked at this institution, you would have to remember that segregation was a fact of life. Yet, 40 years ago, young black women were being trained as nurses and nuns. Our doctors trained there, and our first opportunities as medical technicians were there. The sisters have done so much, and what do they ask? Only that Christ and good people love them for their work and good hearts.
There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. Sometimes I feel discouraged, and I think my work in vain. But then the Holy Spirit revives my soul again. Revives my soul again.
The Sisters of St. Mary and the Sisters of St. Francis continued their separate ministries to the sick throughout the 20th century. They opened hospitals when the need was there and closed them when the need was gone. Just as Mother Odilia had in her day, the sisters did whatever they could to meet the needs of their times, always with love and with a special concern for people who were poor. In the 1980s, the two congregations began to talk seriously about reuniting, about coming back together to form a single congregation. In 1986, the Sisters of St. Mary formed SSM Healthcare as a separate corporation to oversee its hospitals, and Sister Mary Jean Ryan was named President and Chief Executive Officer. The very next year, 1987, in a joyous celebration, the Sisters of St. Mary and the Sisters of St. Francis reunited to form one congregation, the Franciscan Sisters of Mary.
1989. A letter. To whom it may concern. On February 8th, 1939, my father was killed in an automobile accident. He left a widow 3 months pregnant with her 8th child. 4 of the children were born at St. Anthony Hospital. Because of her drastic economic situation, my mother planned to have her 8th child at home. But in August 1939, the sisters from St. Anthony contacted my mother and insisted her 8th child be delivered at the hospital at no charge. Over the years, my mother stressed to us that this was the only act of charity she ever accepted. She taught us the value of hard work and the pride of independence. My mother is now 86 years old and still lives in Oklahoma City. In honor of her, I enclose $1,000 to repay the sisters for their charity. Perhaps it will offset the account never paid in 1939. By the way, I happen to be the 8th child.
For SSM Healthcare, the 1990s and the early years of the 21st century were characterized by an intense focus on quality. The introduction of continuous quality improvement in 1990 and state quality awards a few years later gave SSM Healthcare the tools to move from better than average to something closer to exceptional. In 1998, the system began a year-long process to develop a mission statement and values. Some 3,000 employees from every facility and at every level of the organization took part in the process. The SSM Healthcare mission statement was introduced in 2000.
Through our exceptional healthcare services, we reveal the healing presence of God. Poetry, it is sheer poetry, that mission statement. Who could have asked for a greater gift than to know that all we have held dear for so long will continue far into the future? I cannot describe how pleased Mother Odilia is. When she heard the new mission statement, she wept with joy.
In November 2002, SSM Healthcare became the first healthcare recipient of the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award, the nation's highest honor for quality. The following May, Sister Mary Jean Ryan read these words as she formally accepted the award.
SSM Healthcare's heritage of healing began in 1872, when 5 sisters came to this country from Germany to escape religious persecution. They settled in St. Louis with $5 to their name. Of course, as the need for healthcare increased, our sisters opened first one hospital and then others, responding to requests from communities in need. From our earliest days, our sisters provided care regardless of a patient's ability to pay. Account books from the 1800s identify almost 60% of our patients as ODL, which stood for Our Dear Lords. These were patients who couldn't pay for their care. And so it is today. Although we no longer use the term ODL, I am pleased that in a world where people's worth is often measured in monetary terms, we see each of our patients as a unique human person of worth who is in need of healing. And in our sisters' tradition, we continue to view healthcare as a service to people in need. We still provide care to everyone who comes to our door, regardless of their ability to pay.
How proud we were to hear those words. In today's troubled world, there are still so many people who have so little. But our sisters, the few who remain, and the lay people who are the future of our health ministry, you do so much good in the world. You recognize the inherent good that resides within every patient, and you treat all who come to you tenderly and with love. We watch you from above, Mother Odilia, Mother Seraphia, Mother Augustine, and all the sisters who have led and who have given their lives in service to others. And we see the loving care you extend in the name of God to the people in your communities. This heritage of healing, this heritage that started as a dream of one woman, it flourishes today because of you, because you care as we cared. Know that our prayers are with you always, that we walk with you in spirit, and that we will hold you close in our hearts for all eternity.
On May 5th, 2006, our Heritage of Healing was performed live at an SSM Healthcare gathering. The Franciscan Sisters of Mary who were present were invited onto the stage to be honored. To those sisters and to all our sisters who have given their lives in service, we dedicate this story.
Now is the time to bear the burden of those in